Well, hello everyone and welcome. I hope you're having a good evening and thank you, Tracy. Really appreciate you inviting me to give this talk tonight. And I'd like to start by thanking other people and organizations that have made this project possible and the presentation tonight possible. First of all, the Roseville Library for inviting me and Tracy Wilson, the person who invited me. And I'm also grateful to many others who've supported my work. This has been a project that I started in 2000, so it's been going on a while here. I'm grateful, of course, to Grand Valley State University, where I teach linguistics in the English department, and to my students and colleagues there, and the many participants in my study who've made this research possible, and the University of Wisconsin Press, who published the book, Yooper Talk, Dialect is Identity in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My friends and family who've supported me throughout the project, and of course you. It's a real pleasure for me to share my research with you this evening. My presentation will focus on the social and linguistic history of English in the Upper Peninsula, or Yooper Talk, and I'll explain how the dialect has emerged over time. I'll describe some parts of the dialect, some of the pronunciations, vocabulary, and some of the grammatical structures. And I look forward to your questions and comments, open discussion at the end. I'll probably talk for about 40 minutes or so. Excuse me. I focus my research on the Upper Peninsula in the northwestern part, from Marquette through the Keweenaw Peninsula that you see here circled on the map. I chose this part of the UP not only because it's the area where this stereotypical Yooper voice comes from, but it's also where I have a lot of contacts. I went to graduate school at Michigan Tech, and I have a lot of friends who live in the area, and they were able to introduce me to their friends, and their friends introduced me to their friends. So it was a snowball technique for me to meet people and interview them. Interviews take up a large part of this project. Excuse me. I'm interested particularly in how the idea of the dialect has emerged over time through social and historical events such as immigration and language contact that happens when immigrants come, and language contact between those languages and English, or among those languages as well. Also the language of the indigenous Ojibwe, looking at economic factors like mining and agriculture, timber and tourism, and language attitudes that we have and that we reinforce through media such as movies, TV, social media posts, memes, and our everyday conversations with friends and family, coworkers, jokes we tell, and how all those things combine to create the idea of a dialect. This evening, I'll explain that the dialect, its words and vocabulary, which would be the words, the sounds, grammatical structures, are all a result of these social factors and historical events that continue to draw people to the region, as well as to shape the dialect. To understand what makes a dialect, it's important to know its history. Excuse me. The history of English in the northwestern part of the UP is relatively recent compared to other varieties found throughout the United States. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that English speakers regularly visited and then inhabited the northwestern part of the UP. The dialect's recent history, combined with the area's isolation, the people who've immigrated there, the people who are originally there, where they've settled, the languages that they speak, are all factors that maintain the dialect and its distinct features. There are 5 major factors that have helped the dialect to develop into what we hear and maybe read today. Geography, particularly isolation. If you've ever driven there from where you are in Roseville or other parts of the Lower Peninsula, you know if you want to go up to Copper Harbor, it can take a good 12 hours, or maybe if you're a little speedier, maybe 10 hours. Historical events in the late 1800s and early 1900s, such as the French-Prussian War and World War I, pushed people toward other places, including the UP. Language contact between speakers of English and other languages, including Italian, Polish, German, Canadian French, Finnish, Ojibwe, also known as Anishinaabemoan, and many other languages. Economics is another factor, including access to land, mining, agriculture, shipping, and tourism, and language attitudes, what we think of as good and bad English. Excuse me. To begin, here's an important definition. I'm assuming you all know what a Yooper is, and here's the definition from the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary, which added the word in 2014. As you no doubt know, the name derives from the pronunciation of the acronym for the Upper Peninsula, UP, Yooper, someone from the UP. Because Yooper is a well-known word in Michigan, you might be surprised that it wasn't until, 2014 that it appeared in this popular dictionary. It all began with a Scrabble game, yet it took 12 years and a persistent Scrabble player to get Yooper dictionary worthy. Steve Parks was playing Scrabble and he wanted to use the word Yooper, and his opponent said, no, you can't, it's not in any dictionary. So Parks solicited Merriam-Webster to include Yooper beginning in 2002. His 12-year letter writing campaign finally got Yooper into the dictionary after he had sent the editors of the dictionary enough evidence for the word to be in the dictionary, in this dictionary. In order for a word to be in a dictionary, it has to be shown to be widely recognized. And the editors at the time said, nope, people don't know what this word is. As outside of Michigan, you can't put it, we won't put it in the dictionary. Well, he sent them enough evidence, and there was also an editorial change that probably helped too. So if you look online at the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary, you will find Yooper right between your and yoo-hoo. It wasn't until the mid-1970s, however, that Yooper was popularly used in the UP, as you can see from this timeline. Now, it's important to realize that although Yooper dates back in print from 1975, it existed well before that in spoken language. Words have to exist in spoken language before they appear in print. So everyday conversation, surely Yooper existed before 1975, but this is the first evidence we could find of it in print. In these different examples, we see attitudes at work and their effects on what it means to be a Yooper, some of which are tied to what it means to sound like a Yooper. For example, you see 1975 from the newspaper The Pick and Axe in Bessemer, Michigan. 1982, Michael Luukkonen, who's a sociologist and filmmaker, he attempted to make a film, well, he was making a film, a documentary about what it means to be a Yooper, and he wanted to name his film Yoopers, but he received widespread criticism from older members of the community because Yooper can have derogatory meanings attached to it. It can sometimes be used as a way to denigrate or slam people in certain ways. So he changed the name of his film to Good Man in the Woods. What's interesting, in the 1980s, you also see a connection emerge between what it means to sound like a Yooper and the place, as well as being a Yooper. So in 1983, Jack Bowers of Marquette created a bumper sticker that you've probably seen on cars, or maybe you have one on your car. It's green, it says, say ya to UPA. So there's recognition in the 1980s of these dialect features. The Yoopers, which is a fairly popular band outside the greater Marquette area, until 1986, they were called the Yoopers, and then they changed their names to the Yoopers. So again, you see some connections here with the place and people and the dialect. It's important to recognize that Yooper has contested meanings, that not everyone feels that it's a term they want to be called. And you see that in the example from Michael Luukkonen's film. It can be used derogatorily as well as a point of pride. And you can see these perceptions reflected here. Over the past 30 years, meanings attached to Yooper have become more positive, in part because of the tourist industry and shifting economies that have brought more people to the UP, like the Pure Michigan campaign for one, but also some things that happened where companies started creating more tourist items that claim Yooper identity and have dialect features on them. And I'll show you some of those as we go on. Let's step back in time here a little bit. And for the last 5,000 years, Ojibwe lived in the UP seasonally. Yet it wasn't until the 1600s that French missionaries, French Canadians, voyageurs, and European explorers regularly visited the area. Over the next century, expeditions were made to investigate the rich iron and copper deposits, which led to a determined effort to mine the region. Discovery of the world's largest deposit of native copper in 1842 drew thousands specifically to the Keweenaw Peninsula. And from the 1840s through the early 1900s, it was a booming timber and copper mining region, boasting a population of 80,000 in 1900. In contrast, the most recent census data from the Keweenaw Peninsula that's comprised of Baraga, Houghton, and Keweenaw counties is 46,000. So nearly half as less people live there today as in the early 1900s. As a result of the copper boom, the region became known as the Copper Country, and most adults were in some way connected to the mines and the mining industry. The majority of those who came to work in the mines and related industries, such as logging, which not only was necessary to clear the land to get at the copper and iron ore below, but also was used in framing structures in the mines, railroad ties above and below ground, and specific to the iron industry to make charcoal for firing the kilns. In fact, today, timber and charcoal industries remain vital industries to the UP's economy. Excuse me. Because of these industries and the promise of prosperity, Marquette and the Copper Country drew people from far and wide: Finland, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Cornwall, England, Italy, particularly the Piedmont region, France, Germany, Canada, and the Austrian Empire, what today includes Croatia, Slovenia, Italy, and other places as well, other countries. In addition, people resettled from the Midwest and the East Coast, particularly Boston, and you can see that in some of the place names. If you've ever been to the Keweenaw, there's an area called the Boston location, and Quincy Mine is, namesake is Quincy, Massachusetts. In addition to being pulled to the region, historical events such as war and famine pushed people to the UP from Scandinavia, Finland, Great Britain, Central and Eastern Europe, and beyond. While some people settled in rural areas, others were attracted to larger towns like Marquette, Ontonagon, Calumet, Houghton, Hancock, with the promise of prosperity earned from businesses and shops. Collectively, industry, agriculture, education, and commerce were needed to sustain this burgeoning population. And the growing population and seemingly endless supply of copper and iron continued to draw laborers, merchants, artisans, teachers, and many others to the region through the early 1900s, when production slowed and immigration restrictions curtailed or limited people of certain nationalities from entry in the US. And for example, there was an immigration restrictions in 1924 that limited the amount of Finns that could come to the United States. They were all based on quotas. With the new arrivals came many languages. For example, this is a group of Norwegians in this photo, and their cute little dog. And no doubt they spoke Norwegian, but because of different migration practices between Norway, Sweden, and Finland, usually for agricultural purposes, for farming, these Norwegians no doubt spoke Norwegian, but might have spoken Finnish as well as Swedish, depending on if they had migrated to these places or where they came from in Norway. Further north in Norway, there's land contact with Sweden, that makes for multilingual communities more often than you would find in other parts of Norway. Excuse me. Heritage languages and cultural practices were maintained, of course, through interaction at home, in neighborhoods, rural communities, social organizations, and through church services. For example, in Calumet alone in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were several language-based Catholic churches, including St. Anthony's, which was a Polish church, St. Joseph's, which was a German church, St. Louis was a French church, Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary was an Italian church, and St. John the Baptist was a Croatian church. So we can see here how this was a multilingual community. Sorry. Calumet school records from 1908 also demonstrate that there is this multilingual community. Those records show that there were students from over 40 nationalities, and we can assume that those students spoke at least half as many languages. Evidence of multilingual community also includes Houghton Hancock newspapers that were printed in 6 different languages in the early 1900s. Because the majority of settlers were not native English speakers, they typically learned English from other non-native English speakers. As people mixed and mingled and their languages came into repeated contact with each other and with English, a new variety of English slowly took shape. These languages affected the sounds, the words, grammar that collectively today we recognize as Yooper Talk. Out of all of the languages spoken in the area, Finnish has had a significant effect on English in the Northwestern UP. The influence of Finnish on English is significant for several reasons that resulted in decades of contact between English and Finnish. One reason is Finns were the largest group to immigrate to the area, and they were one of the last groups to immigrate. They also tended to be literate. Whereas immigrant languages are typically lost by the 3rd generation in a family, and that's true today as it was in the past, the Finnish language was maintained in the UP for 4 and 5 generations, in part because unlike the majority of other immigrant families or people who came to the UP, for example, German, Norwegian, Swedish, Italian, French, Finnish isn't related to English, so it makes it more difficult for Finns to learn English. Finns also tended to be literate, as I mentioned, and most other immigrants, working class immigrants, were not literate. And if someone's literate, it helps them maintain their first language, their heritage language, longer through reading, writing, writing letters back home, writing letters to other people in the US or wherever they are in the world, having neighborhood conversations, church services. These all affected a lasting contact of English and lasting contact of English and Finnish. This long contact shaped the sounds, the words, and some of the grammatical structures of English, thereby characterizing what we recognize today as English from the Upper Peninsula. Next, I'll talk about some of the effects of language contact on the phonology or sounds of English in the UP. These are some phonological features, and if you're familiar with the dialect of the northwestern part of the UP, you'll no doubt know that there are other ways of making pronunciations, but these are some more of the characteristic ones. Evidence of language contact is heard in the dialect's phonology or sounds. And here on this slide, you can see I'm using phonetic transcription in the International Phonetic Alphabet to represent the sounds. And these are the letters you see in brackets. For example, the bracketed D is pronounced like D or D, as you might have guessed. Some sounds, or what we call phonemes, are represented with symbols that might be unfamiliar to you. For example, you see a question mark without a dot. That's what we call a symbol for the glottal stop. And that sound, or actually absence of sound, that you hear in uh-oh, and you can do it right now. I won't hear you, but if you put your hand on your throat and you say uh-oh, you can feel your Adam's apple or your larynx jump up and down. And what's happening is we call it a glottal stop because the air comes up into your glottis and stops. It's very descriptive in that. What ends up happening here is that in the UP, people will sometimes substitute that glottal stop or a t for what we call the voiceless th, th, like in the word south. And for example, I have a friend who lived near Sout Range and she would say Sout Range and she had a glottal stop there. You also hear it in Houghton, Houghton. When I say Houghton, or you'll hear it when people in the UP say Houghton too. You might also hear people say South for South in that kind of way too, with the t there. So those two sounds get substituted oftentimes. The reason why what we call the voice th, the like in the, it becomes duh, and south would become sout or sout, is because these two sounds, the and the, those two th sounds are rare in other languages. So you'll find that throughout the world where people speak English, either as a second language or where there are different varieties of English, there will be these substituted sounds. And in fact, these are ubiquitous throughout the United States. If you go, you hear probably Chicago, de bears, right? Louisiana, there's der, dem, dos. Wisconsin, there's der, dem, dos for there, them, those. So these are very common features. Another feature in the UP is this S for the sh, sh sound. So you might hear people say sot. This sound is actually dying, not dying out, but it's not used anymore. People do say the sh sound. And this is an example of Finnish. Finnish doesn't have an sh sound. So the influence of Finnish here has affected the dialect, and older speakers might substitute the s for the sh, but probably most of them are not with us anymore. And I'll talk more about this sh sound a little bit later. We have these voiceless stops, t, p, k. They're usually often stressed, not usually, but often, when people say winter, book, stop, hot, calumet. And it's partly because those three sounds are stressed in Finnish. And again, so this is another example of Finnish contact. We have some vowel sounds too that are low and back, which means your tongue goes back and low. So when I say pasty or camp versus how I say pasty or camp, or some other Michiganders will say pasty or camp. So that ah sound can vary a lot. The O sound, like in boat, you might hear people say boat instead of boat or boat. The ow and I sound before these voiceless sounds, such as s, k, f, like house, ice. The tongue is raised actually, and it's actually called Canadian raising because it's very typical in Ontario and other parts of Canada, but especially Ontario. And for that reason, people who live in the UP and travel outside the area, oftentimes people say, "Are you Canadian?" because they'll hear those sounds. Another feature is the stress for syllable. The town Toivola, people might say Toivola or Toivola, and Toivola is a Finnish word. Finnish stresses the first syllable of every word. English, we stress the first syllable of many of our words, but not all of them. And Toivola here, it means hope, and people who settled there named their town after hope. What we see here is that these are only some of the sounds, and not everyone who lives there uses these sounds, and not everybody who uses them would use them all the time. You know from your own language use that we change the way we speak, whether we realize it or not, when we interact with different people in different contexts. In this next slide, we'll see how the phonology is also a clue to the sociolinguistic history of the area. Calcite Lats is a result of this sociolinguistic history, so the social and the linguistic histories, but the symbolism, and this is actually, sign is actually started as a joke, is often lost on even local residents. The two signs, the one handmade and the other official township street sign that you see in the back, are located on Quincy Hill, just outside of Hancock on US 41, which you see there in the picture. And it's near the Quincy Mine Hoist, which today is a popular tourist attraction. And you can, oops, didn't mean to do that. I was going to use my cursor to show you the mine hoist right back here. And it's a popular tourist attraction today. And the Quincy mine was in full operation from 1846 to 1945, and many of the miners lived in company-owned housing that skirted the mine. Mining families often had a cow, and some houses included a cow shed or a single stall barn. Family members or a neighbor would take the cows to graze in the communal pasture, and the communal pasture was called the flats. And the flats was provided by the mining company, just as the houses were. And locally though, the mining housing areas around the mine were called locations. This location was mostly Finnish speakers or Finnish settler people who came from Finland. And the pasture was jokingly called Calcite Lats. In the 1980s, Wilbur Salmi, who lived in the area, made this street sign, the one you see in the foreground, and it mirrors the official sign in the background. He placed the sign at the intersection and approached the Quincy Township Board with the request that the road be officially named Calcite Lats. So that official street sign name didn't exist then. At the time, streets didn't have official names and instead were known by geographical features, homestead, mining locations, or town names. In the town, in Hancock or Houghton, streets had names, but out in the township areas, they didn't usually have names that were on signs. People knew what the names were. It wasn't until 2001 when the emergency telephone number 911 was established that the township had to name these streets, and they officially named the road Calcite Lats. They placed this official street sign at the intersection while keeping Salmi's original sign. And sadly, his sign has since disappeared. I took this photo in 2002, and when I was back 2 years ago, the sign wasn't there anymore. In addition to the history behind the name, understanding its meaning relies on recognition of local linguistic features that have transferred from Finnish to English. And one of those is one I just talked about, was this S for the SH sound. Another example of this is the L sound for the FL on flats. Remember I said the flats was a name for a cow pasture. Knowing that the Finnish alphabet doesn't include the letter C and instead substitutes a K in spelling things in English, that's what you see here. So the K for it would be a C. So you've probably guessed that this sign really is Calcite Flats. The pun's a result of language contact and transfer between English and Finnish. Finnish doesn't have the SH sound, so people substitute the S, right, or the S sound. And similarly, the consonant cluster, where two consonants together, the F and the L, or fl at the beginning of flats, is not a part of Finnish phonology. In other words, Finnish doesn't allow for two consonants to come together like that at the beginning of words. So what people who will often do if they're speaking English as a second language, and their first language is Finnish, is to drop the first consonant. And that's what's happening here. Instead of flats, you get lats. The sign's also important evidence of local dialect features that have changed since the 1980s. For example, it's rare nowadays to hear locals pronounce S for SH. And this change can give the impression that the dialect is dying, but that's not the case. It's just changing. As the people who spoke Finnish as a first language have passed away, those dialect features have changed as new generations are speaking the dialect. Regional dialects and other ways of speaking locally in the UP or anywhere else aren't dying out. In fact, there's research that demonstrates that some features become stronger over time. As people move to an area, how better way to show that they belong, but to adopt some of the linguistic features, and that in that way they can become stronger. But dialects, like language in general, do change, and it has to change. Dialects have to change as society changes, and changes are what people hear and then think that the dialect is dying. The local pronunciation of sauna is another example of language contact between English and Finnish. No doubt Swedish, Norwegian, German, which also share this pronunciation. This pronunciation in the UP, sauna for sauna, signals local identity. And this linguistic identity marker is called a shibboleth. Shibboleths are pronunciations that indicate insider and outsider identities. Insiders say sauna, outsiders typically say sauna. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the UP says sauna. Some people do say sauna, and it doesn't mean that if you live outside the UP, you don't say sauna. So there is some variation there. In this set of billboards that were outside of Ishpeming in 2015, we see the shibboleth sauna contrasted with sauna. What's most interesting to me is how this insurance company uses the shibboleth and this contrast. The local pronunciation sauna symbolizes positive meanings associated with being local, trustworthy, honest, reliable, folks who know and understand you and your insurance needs. Another example of a shibboleth is the pronunciation of pasty. And this is a magnet I found at a tourist shop. And this magnet emphasizes local ways of speaking and knowing by instructing, presumably outsiders, how to pronounce or really not pronounce pasty. However, what we hear today as local or sounding Yooper hasn't always been associated with the UP. The meanings that we attach to the dialect today are relatively new, and these linguistic features that we recognize as sounding Yooper at one time were associated with being an immigrant, being working class, or both. And like in the past, immigrant and working class overlap today. Previous to the mid-1900s, linguistic features like the de for the, like you see here, this is the Wreck of the Julie Plante is a shipping song from the Great Lakes. And it was sung, and here it's supposedly sung by French Canadians. And we can tell that through the dialect features here. And not just the de for the, like Lac Saint Pierre, the wind she blow, denda, then the captain, throw the, troda, and then tree four, 3-4. You can see other pronunciations here and how it's spelled would be associated with what it means to be French Canadian, not what it means to be a Yooper. The other example is a joke from the Cleveland Leader that was that's a newspaper that was reprinted in the Daily Mining Gazette newspaper in 1905. So both of these come from 1905 and were reprinted in the newspaper. The second one is interesting to me because it's using dat and use and dat for that, and the plural use. Those are both features that today we associate with what it sounds like to be a Yooper. But in this case, it's signaling that someone's working class. And you can tell that from the text here. And what also is interesting to me that people recognize this outside of the UP. What's happened in the mid-19th century that caused these features to be recognized as Yooper? Well, in part, the dialect had time to develop. If you remember, it wasn't until the mid-1800s that English speakers regularly settled and visited the area. By the mid-1900s, there had been 3-4 generations of speakers that took place, that people then were speaking English as a first language. It's also motivated by a generation of Americans who were born in the 1930s, 1940s, whose parents wanted them to speak English rather than the home or heritage language. This was also affected by the post-war boom and the building of the Mackinac Bridge, which brought more people to the UP from outside the region, Lower Peninsula, other parts of the Midwest, and then brought in different dialects in contact with local ways of speaking. In this next section, we'll look at the lexicon or vocabulary and how local ways of speaking and everyday language use also are clues to language contact and a window into the area's social and linguistic past. These are just some characteristic linguistic features that I've collected and that people use. Some of them aren't used as much anymore. And for example, you can see these features or vocabulary reflecting various languages that have come into contact throughout since the mid-1800s in the region. For example, Canadian French speakers gave us chook and Qatar, and Qatar is one that's not used very much anymore. Some older people might know it, but as far as I know, people aren't using it anymore. When I did my interviews in 2000, there was an older man, he was in his 80s, who used Qatar. In fact, he said, I have Qatar, and he had a cold. So he used it in everyday conversation. Cornish English gave us bush and bloody, perhaps a, and I'll talk about that later, like it's a beautiful day, a. And Irish English gave us the plural use, and Ojibwe gave us a lot of place names and direct translations of place names. Kiwanam, Munising, Ishpeming, those are all Anishinaabemoan or Ojibwe words. Presque Isle is Canadian French, but Laughing Whitefish River, that's a direct translation from Ojibwe. And Lake Superior is English from Canadian French. Ojibwe also gave us choppers and perhaps, and perhaps the word mittens too, that I don't have on here. And mittens are not necessarily, they're a local feature, but they're used without, that word's used outside of the area too. We see food names from German, Finnish, Slovenian, Croatian. In fact, foodways and place names provide some of the best evidence of an area's social and linguistic history. If you take a map of Michigan and look at the different place names, and you are able to recognize what languages have shaped those place names, you can see settlement patterns and the different groups that came to Michigan and where they settled. These are just a few examples of lexical features, and I'm sure that some of you might be able to even add to this list. On this map, we see several other words and phrases that are recognized as Yooper Talk. What's interesting to me is that while some of these linguistic features are recognized as sounding Yooper, like sauna and a and swampers, choppers, other words like bakery that you see over here are not recognized as sounding local. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Bakery is used locally, but people don't seem to recognize it as a local dialect feature. I've never found a magnet, a cap, a coffee mug, a t-shirt that says, give me some bakery, I speak Yooper, or anything like that connecting. I don't find any evidence of connecting bakery to the place like you see with other dialect features. Bakery comes from German. It's a direct translation for baked goods, not the place where the baked goods are made. And this was a sign at the Covington Music Festival several years ago. If you go to Milwaukee, and you might know that Wisconsin had a high German population, immigration population. If you go to Milwaukee and you go to a bakery, people will ask you, what bakery do you want? They will ask you about the baked goods using the word bakery. Another example of a local dialect feature is particularly interesting to me because many UP residents, specifically those from mining towns, recognize the word, use it, and understand that it's part of the dialect. The word is pank, and I saw that one of the participants here, one of the audience members, has pank as their last name, and I didn't know if pank was the last name or they were claiming their Yooper identity. What's more significant, that people in the UP who use pank think that word is unique to the UP. However, we can see in this entry from the Dictionary of American Regional English that pank is used chiefly in Michigan, but also Pennsylvania and upstate New York. What these distinct regions have in common is a history of mining, and we dialectologists think that the word must have come from miners and mining terminology, especially given the similar word banka in Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, and the fact that Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians immigrated to these three areas and often worked in the mines. In addition to the dialect's phonology and lexicon, language contact is also found in its syntax or grammatical structures, how words are ordered in phrases and sentences. The first two examples are from Finnish English contact, and the third example is from contact between English and several languages. Illative phrases, or those that indicate movement to or into a location, often omit prepositions, the absence of some other prepositions, as well as articles, a, an, and the. This is all a result of contact between Finnish and English. Finnish grammatical structures don't include articles like a, an, and the, or prepositions, where English grammar does use prepositions, words before nouns to indicate location, like near or at, or to or toward. Instead, Finnish grammar uses postpositions, which are suffixes or word endings on the ends of nouns to indicate the same thing. You can hear that in some places in the Northwestern UP when people say, let's go mall, or I went post office. A and hey demonstrate how several languages, Ojibwe, Cornish English, Canadian French, can be the source of a word and grammatical structure. It's no surprise that all three languages have similar sounding words, and the use of what has come to the dialect is a and hey. What's important to realize is that grammatical structures of the dialect, really of any dialect, are not bad English, improper or ungrammatical. In fact, they're examples of grammatical rule-bound features that structure the dialect and that result from the grammatical rules of one language transferring to another. Definitions of good and bad English are based on language attitudes rather than grammatical rules that distinguish one dialect from another. In this example, you see a university student's essay, part of an essay, and it demonstrates how language attitudes can and do affect individuals and can also affect the dialect itself by shaming people into not using it. I'll just read this and then I'll say a little bit about it. 3 summers ago, while attending classes, I was sitting in class listening to the professor read over the syllabus. She veered from the syllabus when she began speaking about the upcoming oral presentations. At this point, she polled the class to find out how many Yoopers were in attendance. I looked around and no one raised a hand, including myself. So you know that there were other Yooper students in this class. I did this for 3 reasons. 1, I was a freshman. 2, the class terrified me. And 3, I was not going to be studied all term as if I were a dying species. She continued with a comment about Yoopers who attend the university by stating, when they're giving presentations, I always feel so sorry for them. The class chuckled, agreeing that Yoopers sound funny and showed sympathy. About 10 minutes later, I left the class and almost left the university. Linguistic prejudice and related language attitudes have real and lasting effects, especially for those who are labeled with speaking bad English or sounding funny, whether it's a social variety like African American English or a regional dialect like Yooper Talk. For this student, the effects were significant. She dropped a class and almost dropped out of school. Part of my interest in studying Yooper Talk and language variation in general is my belief that we can foster social understanding, respect, and compassion by understanding that language variation is just that, variation of a language. If we're aware of these variations, we can understand how the dialect is structured. If we understand the history of a dialect, we can understand what languages have come into contact and what have affected that dialect. On the words, the sounds, the grammatical structures, and then we understand better the social and linguistic factors that have shaped it. This understanding can help us understand that dialects are seen as bad, or excuse me, that are some people see as bad English or improper, are actually rule governed, resulting from language contact. And I gave examples of that, especially with the grammatical structures and some of the phonological or sound features. Unfortunately, the prejudice that's often attached to dialects and accents is not grounded in linguistic fact, but instead on prejudice about the speakers, as we see here. Linguistic prejudice is a mirror of social prejudice. In any society around the world, if you want to find out what groups are stigmatized, find out what dialects are stigmatized, and vice versa. If you want to find out what people think is bad English or whatever bad language, whatever place you're in, ask about what groups are stigmatized. It's important to realize that all of us, you, me, your high school English teacher way back in the day, we all have a dialect. No one is dialect free. It's the attitudes and values that we attach to particular ways of speaking and thereby to certain groups of people and groups of speakers that make us think that some of us are dialect free and others speak at least with a quaint accent and at the most with bad English. All dialects are grammatical and rule governed, although the rules vary. That's why we call them varieties of English or of a language. As we've seen in the previous examples, history and the interaction resulting in language contact are key ingredients that have shaped the variety of English, American English, that we recognize as Yooper Talk. And here are some, and here we see how attitudes toward dialects and perceptions about dialect speakers are also significant factors in shaping dialects and affecting their use. While there's some negative stereotypes associated with what it means to be a Yooper and what it means to sound like a Yooper, at the same time, there's great pride in being a Yooper and sounding like a Yooper. For example, in the UP, there comes a fierce pride about being local as a do-it-yourself, get by with what you have independence that's rooted in a history of hard labor in an isolated place that has a climate that can be sometimes difficult to live in. This magnet reflects the connections between identity, place, and language with proud, tough, independent, and by mapping Yooper right onto the UP. Reflected in this magnet is the most compelling reason for the maintenance of dialect differences, identity. Our language is one of the most obvious ways in which we mark who we are, where we're from, and where we've been. This not only includes our region, but our social class, our gender, sexuality, age, race, religious affiliations, education, and all the other ways which we categorize ourselves culturally and socially. Language is our badge of identity. How else do we show where we're from, who our family is, what our communities are, our genders, our ages, the values we hold dear? And for this reason, dialects, including Yooper Talk, are not dying out. They'll change over time, and they must as society changes. As the linguistic landscape shrinks through online and geographic interconnectedness, local ways of speaking remain our badge of identity, and thus dialects are here to stay. In conclusion, how do dialects like Yooper Talk emerge? Over time and through interaction, through us, as we shape history, as we share our attitudes about dialects in social media and conversations with friends, coworkers, family, and as we interact with others, and as our dialects and languages come into contact. As with any dialect, the sounds, the words, phrases, and sentence structures combine in unique ways to create UP English. By knowing the history of UP English, we come to understand how people, place, and language are tightly bound together. My hope is that by understanding the history of Yooper Talk, that you come to understand not only how and why dialects develop, but also that each of us have a role in affecting language change, as well as affecting language attitudes and perceptions of people who might speak differently than you or me. I also hope that this understanding leads you to an appreciation of the UP, of Yoopers, and for language variation in all its forms. Thank you. I will stop sharing now and